It's 4 weeks to go till the Spectators Energy Summit, chaired by the Wolfe Power Club. One of the big issues that's going to be constant throughout the sessions is energy security and diversity of supply. This week we're going to look at the paradox of sanctions against the Russian oil companies Rosneft and Lukoil, and we're going to look at actually what it means for the sector. We'll also later on in the episode going to explain that why one of the paradoxes involved the most famous tennis club in the world, Wimbledon, behind us, and watch out and look. Now, time to listen to the Donald.
Well, I don't know that they will. I think that they'll certainly have an impact. They're massive sanctions. It's sanctions on oil. The two biggest oil companies, among the biggest in the world, but they're Russian. They do a lot of oil. And hopefully it'll push... hopefully he'll become reasonable, and hopefully Zelensky will be reasonable too. You know, it takes two to tango, as they say.
Hello, it's Michael Gove here, editor of The Spectator. Alongside Wolfe Power Club, we'll be holding a fantastic energy conference on Monday the 24th of November. We'll be bringing together people from politics, from industry and from the third sector to discuss the future of energy here in the UK and across the world. Get your tickets now.
So, since we were last with you guys, at the end of last week, Donald Trump has put forward the act to basically mean that you cannot trade or financially be involved with Rosneft and Lukoil. The consequence of that means that both American organisations can't have any trading in an energy sense, but it also means from a financial sense, a pension fund or so on can't have investment. The other bit that he said is that there could be secondary sanctions of those involved and following up with those people to essentially get involved. And what he's really implying at is the likes of China and India, that are some of the biggest buyers of gas and oil from Russia since the start of the Ukraine conflict in spring of 2022. Now, the consequence of that means that Rosneft and Lukoil, and there's a wonderful article by Reuters Romboso, which we've put a link in below, that gives all the stats and the commercial relationships. But here are some of the headlines from that article. Those two companies between them supplied 47% of external trade from Russia to the rest of the world last year. What that means is that significant trade means that essentially that they make up a huge part of the Russian economy. We then look at the fact that in Russia, 25% of their GDP is made up of oil and gas sales. So essentially, that companies between them essentially providing 1/8 of the Russian economy. And the reason we're doing it is that whereas towards the end of the summer it looked like, following the success in the Middle East, that Donald Trump would be able to get Putin to a summit in Central Europe, this all broke down towards the end of last week when the demands from Russia and the non-compliance of what needed to happen before they sat down between America, Russia and Ukraine fell to pieces. The retaliation or reaction by Donald Trump was through sanctions. Now, just to be very clear, as a podcast, we are very pro-Ukraine, and we're also very pro actually the use of punishing and snoozing energy as a way to actually stop funding. Because the ultimate effect, as you look at Ron's article, is then it creates this incredible energy debate, but also this massive geopolitical problem. So what's the big energy debate? OPEC is meeting on the 2nd of November to try and increase fuel production. As Ron article said, it's increased 2.7 billion barrels a day, and the Saudis want to increase by a further 160,000 across OPEC members. Now, there's not many OPEC members that can cause the increase of fuel, but certainly what can happen is that Russia can play their role in it. Now, interesting, the news since Donald Trump actually put these sanctions in place on Rosneft and Lukoil is that since the 23rd of October, and as we film, we're a few days later on the 28th of October, what you've seen is that essentially the oil price per barrel has jumped by nearly $5 and has gone above $66 per barrel. Now, what's interesting about that is that already that means that Russia come wealthier because barrels of oil more. So that's the first paradox, is that any sanctions or bans quite often put the unit price up, and therefore a country can actually produce and sell less and still actually get the same or better financial output. We actually saw this in 2022, that although many issues of fuel supply happen across the sector and across the world, mega profits were made because of that supply shortness that led to it. The other problem we've seen is that essentially nothing seems to have really affected Russia's international trade, despite the EU, UK and America previously having sanctions and ongoing sanctions. So interestingly, in Ron's Reuters article, it says before Ukraine, the country was exporting annually about 8 billion barrels, and since the sanctions, it's just below 8 billion barrels. So essentially it has had no real impact. And the reason it's had no real impact is that China and India have taken up that surplus supply and cheaper energy. And then it creates another dilemma. It means that China and India, which are both international massive trade partners of US, UK, Europe, not only are they getting cheaper energy, but in the West you're getting more expensive energy. So a bit like when we've always debated about labour costs over the last decade, you suddenly have a massive cost differential on just neat oil and gas, and that creates massive issues. So we then enter this paradox situation. What are then some of the consequences, and why are we in front of the most famous tennis club in the world? Well, the reality is every time you do something action, there's a reaction that can both have positive and negative influence. Now, one of the things we would say, and the reason why you're trying to do sanctions, and this is where we wholeheartedly support on the Wolfe Power Club, is that so far to date, since spring 2022 till about now, most worldwide economic estimates are that the Russian government has spent £350 billion trying to invade Ukraine. Now, if 25% of their economy is coming from the oil and gas sector, it means that those purchases by China and India and the other world market clients that haven't put in sanctions means that the result of it is that probably $90 billion of support has essentially come from the demand from countries still working with Russia to do that. Now, several actions were done, such as Germany's reliant on gas means they've looked at other fuels and sources, but they've still to this day got refineries that are in a special sort of partnership and custodianship, but do have Russian influence in terms of either former Rosneft employees or current Rosneft employees involved in it, and it's got them scratching about how they move away from it. There's also been accusations of shadow fleets that actually countries have put in sanctions have then traded for a number of different countries, and so the fuel starts off Russian, but by the time it gets to you is no longer Russian, and same with energy, and therefore the country can say they're no longer dealing with Russia, but all they're doing is actually putting more premium in, and Russia's still getting the benefit. So that is another consequence we've seen. And then you're probably asking the reason again, why are we in front of, and we go into the consequences of what happened as a result of sanctions since 2022. And one of those consequences actually involves the most famous tennis club in the world, Wimbledon, or the Wimbledon Championships. Now, the British government in that spring of 2022 acted very quickly to say that all businesses and all entities had to cut Russian and Belarusian ties. Now, the most significant one was probably a visual sense in sport, was that Roman Abramovich, as a Russian owner, had to sell Chelsea football clubs. Russian oligarchs had to leave and relinquish London property, assets and capital shares. Now, another big one is not only in addition to Chelsea, you had the All England club, which was heading into its summer championships in 2022. Now, they consulted with government, and it left them in a position where they had to act, and where their action was is to take away the invitations for the summer British tennis season from the All England Championships, and also the non-allowance of LTA events. So that'd be like the Queen's, Eastbourne, Nottingham, Surbiton that year, that basically meant that Russian and Belarusian players couldn't play. Now, what was difficult was they were the first a big tournament where a nation government had banned the stuff, and they had to act in line with the nation government rather than the sporting body. As a result of that, the backlash was that actually ATP and WTA each fined the All England Club and LTA together, so the governing body and the club itself, $1 million each. Now, a year later, that fine was actually reduced to $500,000 each, but it's still two $500,000 together. And as a result of that $500,000 reduction, nice white van driver there, as a result of that $500,000 reduction, you still had $1 million between the two organisations fining them. The reason for the reduction was the players were allowed back in 2023, but without their flags, without their country name, and without recognition. That's still the case to this day. But essentially, it didn't stop any offensive on Russia or Ukraine. And actually what happened was $1 million cost to British tennis as a consequence. Now, in the grand scheme of things, you might think that's quite small, but it then goes into the other economic costs that we saw as a result of the British government policy. And I'm not saying these things are wrong, because actually to make a stance, but it just shows the cost of making a stance. BP had to divest 19.7% of their ownership of Rosneft, the company now that's just also had further sanctions against it by Trump. Now, in terms of capital write-off, that capital write-off was £20 billion. Then Shell had various ownerships and tradings relating to Sakhalin and so on, and it gave up those, and it put those capital losses at 4 to 5 billion. And then a similar example happened to Centrica, where it had various relationships with various pipelines and so on, and it went into the hundreds of millions of costs that had to be given up. Now, everyone's going to say, but Alex, those energy companies at the same time made a significant profit because the price of energy jumped. But that's where the paradox comes. One, the price of energy jumped also for Russian entities, and therefore meant that their profitability was one of their record years, even if production and sales were slightly down. And two, what it means is that you've lost the asset. So the investment, energy and time that you've put in outside the financial devaluation, the years, means that you won't actually get that income back in future years, and essentially open up the market to investors outside of the EU, US and UK, and leads to divergence of ownership, but also it leads to the economic impact specifically hitting the Western companies, which then leads to job potential losses in the US, UK and EU, and also has led to then other consequences. So what have been the other consequences? So some of the other consequences that we've then seen as a result of that is probably the biggest one. Ultimately, this action was done to make sure that Putin lost the war and lost power. What we've actually seen, and as they say, you can't say it's the sole factor because there's so many different factors, but it played a significant part when you look at any polling data. When you look at since the Ukraine conflict, the governments in US, UK and Germany all lost their elections. And one of the biggest causes they lost their elections was the cost of energy, and was also, therefore, the cost of inflation across the board on things like food and other products. It's why when we've previously had the Norwegian Prime Minister on the podcast, he talked about being ethical to supply extra gas to keep the price of bread down. But the reality is, people said that Joe Biden / Kamala Harris ticket, there was a number of reasons, but one of the biggest reasons was that the cost of eggs had gone up so much in inflation, and that's because the cost of energy to the US went up significantly. So you could argue that actually one of the domino effects of the sanctions was it actually supported general opinion of high cost of living and poverty in the West that led them to voting out their governments that was standing up. Then there's the United Kingdom, where no doubt, although there was many issues that led to the Conservatives going out of power, again, one of the biggest things is energy costs, and it's still to this day energy costs. It's going to be one of the biggest issues at the Spectator Summit. We've got a debate on wind and the issues about can you invest into wind and so on. So you could argue that energy sanctions have played a factor, and I'm not saying it's the total reason, but has played a factor in terms of in the US, UK and Germany, three of the strongest powers against Ukraine, losing their seats and losing their government positions. The other thing that it's led to, and I think that this is actually one of the massive consequences on net zero, and don't worry, we have got a happy ending that does come, is that people now are challenging any costs investing in energy transition. Last night I was with Lord John Gummer, and he was talking about the importance that we need to invest in renewables. And yet even on this podcast we've had Catherine Porter talking about the change in Wimbledon subsidies and what people think against the cost of the likes of energy from more traditional sources. Now, people debate these facts and figures, and this debate is going to be happening at the Energy Summit. But what is clear to us is that the debate rages on and has really hit net zero this year. I've been at energy conferences probably every couple of 10 days to 2 weeks, and the cost of energy gets raised again and again, and in part it has been that change in sanctions and change of where Russian supplies its fuel. However, I am the happiest man in the energy industry, and I do want to end on a happy note to end with. And the happy note I want to end with is that the following. One thing that has come clear is that solar, storage and wind are now being called the freedom fuels. And the reason they're called the freedom fuels is because that actually you can supply them at home and your land. Go back to Luciana Berger episode about why energy storage is so important to actually independence. And what it means is that although net zero is being challenged, although sanctions have had this paradox, is that actually there is hope at the end of it, and that the freedom from the likes of solar, wind and storage can provide our sector. It also means that there's been big investments since 2022 in restarting homegrown nuclear projects, stuff that wasn't even considered before. So the paradox is, sanctions are done to cut off Russia's income stream. The flip side, though, is you see a jump in fuel prices, and that jump in fuel prices can actually lead to more income to Russia. And what we've seen in the last 3 years is, despite sanctions of various different types and then these additional ones to Rosneft and Lukoil, although it stops financing of these companies, it hasn't stopped exporting and has actually helped the commodity price for that Russian war effort, of where we think nearly 90 billion has been funded for essentially energy usage. But the golden hope is that essentially it will lead to more of us thinking about energy security and freedom fuels like solar, like storage and wind. I can't wait to see you all in person in under 4 weeks now at the Spectator Energy Summit. News code WPC25. Thank you for your indulgence. Alex Wolfe.